Hello everyone, my name is Garvin and I read things and chatter about them on the internet for your entertainment. So today we look at a modern creation that uses a lot of the same themes and ideas of mermaid mythology, but kind of spins them on their head in a way. We're going to talk about the deep ones of Lovecraftian lore. These creatures have proven a lasting and popular creation of Lovecraft's, and today we're going to look at their creator briefly, and we're going to take a look at their origin and use in the stories. Before I begin, I would like to note that this topic was chosen by my ever-wise patrons. There was a specific poll to see if there should be a Deep One video, and it won the vote. If you would like to have that kind of power where you can decide what videos are made by this channel, join our ranks for as little as $1 a month by clicking on the link in the description below. If you'd rather leave a one-time donation, there's also a link to a coffee site of mine, and if you do leave a one-time donation, please feel free to leave a request for a future video. I will be happy to take a look at that, and I will do my best to get you that video as quickly as possible. With all that said, let's get to the topic at hand. So, I feel doing a deep dive into HP Lovecraft's life is something that's going to require its own video, and I'm going to need a lot of lead time on that just because there is so much conflicting information on this man. To give you guys an idea, I tried just doing research on his diet, and I got stuff like he could only eat beans and hard candy with ice cream. He was a vegetarian and could eat fresh fruits and vegetables. He loved donuts, and he was not particularly restricted in his diet at all. In fact, was a big fan of ham and cheese sandwiches. Most of my sources agreed that he was terrified of seafood and scared of the ocean in general. So I'm tentatively saying that he didn't eat seafood and was scared of the sea, but I am going to put an asterisk on that because I'm not sure with this guy. There is just so much myth and legend surrounding this writer. It's kind of wild. A lot of my sources like to diagnose him with anxiety disorders, depression, insomnia, and just this basket of different social, emotional, and mental disorders. And most of these are people who are looking at him from like over half a century away, so I'm kind of doubtful on any authoritative diagnosis. That said, here's what I can tell you actually happened. This is what I can confirm. So, Lovecraft was born in 1890. His father was committed in 1893 following a psychotic episode in Chicago. This is before HP Lovecraft's 3rd birthday. I can also confirm that HP Lovecraft suffered night terrors starting in 1896 with his grandmother's death. Most of my sources agree that Lovecraft's father was diagnosed with general paralysis, which at the time was synonymous with late-stage syphilis. That doesn't mean he had late-stage syphilis, just that it's a high possibility. His mother would also be committed, but not until 1919. And there would be reports that she acted strangely and had outbursts for years before then. She would also, according to different witnesses, say very strange things like claiming H.P. Lovecraft was hideously deformed and he needed to avoid crowds and sunlight for his own health. So there's a lot of strangeness here. As for H.P. Lovecraft himself, he had frequent breakdowns of an unidentified nature, and he complained of frequent headaches and other pains throughout his life. He often had to be withdrawn from school during childhood for health reasons. Despite this, he did try to join the US Army in 1917 to go to Europe and fight World War I, but According to the sources I found, he was either rejected for health reasons, which strikes me as entirely possible, or his mother used her various political connections, because she was from an old family in Rhode Island, to prevent him from not just joining the U.S. Army, but from joining the Rhode Island National Guard. So, by the time he was an adult, he was suffering night terrors, was convinced he was actually very deformed, and according to my sources, he had suffered through at least one robbery. Now, he was also incredibly racist even for his time, and I can't help but wonder if his life experience and his mental illnesses, assuming he had one, it looks probable to me though, influenced it. That said, none of that excuses that, and we have to be honest about that. It's especially relevant here because the Deep Ones, as we'll see, are born from his xenophobia, his racism, and above all, his screaming fear of race mixing, which is weird because the woman he would call the love of his life was a Ukrainian Jew. And it's things like that that just lend to the sheer confusion and myth that's around HP Lovecraft, and why I would actually want to stop and take several weeks to just find good sources and drill down on what's actually going on with this dude before I produced a video on him. So I hope you guys understand why there's a lot of I think and maybes in these last two paragraphs. The Deep Ones themselves are a lot more straightforward and simple to grapple with. They were first hinted at in the story Dagon, written in 1917. The protagonist is a sailor fleeing a ship that has been taken over by German raiders in the Pacific, and he finds a strange, unknown land that he believes to be part of the ocean floor that was thrown up to the surface, possibly by volcanic activity. After days of exploring this strange place, he comes to a giant white stone covered in unknown hieroglyphics with crude sculptures arrayed around it. And I'm going to read directly from the text here describing this stuff because it is a ride. Buckle up. Men, at least a certain sort of men, though the creatures were shown disporting like fishes in the waters of some marine grotto, or paying homage at some monolithic shrine which appeared to be under the waves as well. They were damnably human in general outline, despite webbed hands and feet, shockingly wide, flabby lips, glassy, bulging eyes, and other features less pleasant to recall. Curiously enough, they seem to have been chiseled badly out of proportion with their scenic background, for one of the characters was shown in the act of killing a whale represented as little larger than himself. Our protagonist's explorations are interrupted by a creature rising from the depths, much like the ones in the sculptures that I just described. He sees it as so deformed that our protagonist flees in panic back to his lifeboat, and his memory is so disjointed that he only remembers suffering through a great storm and waking up in San Francisco. He is so haunted by what he saw and discovered that he's unable to find any answers in any place that he looks, and he only finds relief from nightmares and visions through the use of morphine and other drugs. However, as his money and supply run out, and he faces a life of no relief from his visions and nightmares, he resolves to kill himself after writing everything down. It's unclear if he actually goes through with his suicide, because the story ends with the narrator hearing a strange sound at his door, as if something large, heavy, and wet was slamming against it, and screaming in terror at the sight of a strange hand gripping the window. And that's where the story stops. Their main appearance in Lovecraftian lore, and the story that would make them famous, is the shadow over Innsmouth, where the Deep Ones make a bargain with a dying New England town to provide fish and gold in exchange for human sacrifices and mates. This not only results in most of the town eventually being made up of human Deep One hybrids, but in also a cultural and social isolation from the rest of New England, has things like a Dagon-centered religion. The esoteric Order of Dagon pushes out Christian churches, and other villages and towns turn their back socially and economically on Innsmouth, making it even more dependent on the Deep Ones. The story has an infamous twist ending, and unlike a lot of Lovecraft stories, actually has a fair bit of action. The protagonist is actually quite active and, forward-moving. So, unlike a lot of Lovecraft's protagonists who can sometimes be a bit passive, this dude is moving, and I like that. I've linked both Shadow over Innsmouth and Dagon below in the description, so you can read the stories directly. The Deep Ones would be hinted at in other stories, like The Thing on the Doorstep, where one of the characters is from Innsmouth and may be a hybrid herself, but as far as I could find, they don't make any further direct appearances, at least not in stories written by Lovecraft. That said, the Deep Ones would prove to be one of Lovecraft's most successful and enduring creations. They've been adopted by other writers, both writing Lovecraftian stories set in the Lovecraft universe and outside of it. They have appeared in various movies, video games, and other media. To give you some examples, George R.R. Martin hints at Deep Ones in A Song of Ice and Fire, aka Game of Thrones, if you prefer that. There is a 2020 horror film called The Deep Ones. That's about them. In most of these appearances, they're portrayed as fairly antagonistic towards humanity, at least humanity as a species, while they are willing to bargain or use individuals or small group of humans to further their own ends. There are two examples from written fiction that I want to touch on, though. First is Charles Stross's Laundry series. In the second book, The Jennifer Morgue, they're presented as a group of alien colonists who moved into our oceans before humanity even evolved. And when humanity did evolve, they decided to make a secret treaty with us once we had advanced far enough along to be worth it, that granted us control over the land and parts of the ocean surface, but barred us from the depths past a certain level. These Deep Ones are portrayed as a powerful species that could wipe us out, which is interesting because in Shadows over Innsmouth, the US government was able to basically wipe out Innsmouth and launch a direct attack on a city of theirs that was considered, for the most part, successful using torpedoes and depth charges. The second example from written fiction I would like to use is the Innsmouth Legacy series, which actually builds on Shadow over Innsmouth and reinvents the Deep Ones as a misunderstood branch of humanity that was abused by the US government in the 1930s and 40s. With the main character being a member of the Deep Ones, she is recruited by the FBI to investigate cult activities with the goal of trying to separate harmless Lovecraftian cults from ones that might be dangerous to US citizens. It's a 3-book series. I've only read the first one, The Litany of Earth, but I do recommend it. Give it a shot. So, to bring us back to mermaids, Deep Ones have a literal hybrid form. They are aquatic and physical, so they do loosely meet the definition I set out for mermaid way back in video 1 of this series. They also use a lot of the themes we've seen in mermaid lore. There's transformation, both of the self and others, that is very much part of Deep One's stories. There's what we'll call romance, in order to appease our dread Lord Algorithm, terror be on his name, as well as the idea of supernatural powers, with deep ones being able to bring blessings to their allies and subjects in the form of food, fish, and wealth, usually gold, although at a steep price. What's interesting is in most traditional folklore and mythology, alliance or even romance with mermaids isn't presented as a bad thing, but in Lovecraft's world, it's terrible beyond imagining. Where in traditional stories, the children of Merfolk are either considered as gifted or special. We see that in Hans, the mermaid's son. We see that in Melusaline's story, where yes, the kids were not quite normal, but most of them were rather heroic and gifted in other ways. In Lovecraft's world, these children are a hidden curse, a wedge for the further violation and destruction of our species. And I'm going to take the unpopular stance that while Lovecraft cooked things to an extreme, he wasn't voicing opinions that were outside of society in his day. And I think the change in attitude from the medieval period to the Enlightenment and the colonial periods created a society that was more apt to view a mixed heritage as a dangerous thing of horror rather than a source of strength, and the idea of friendship with others, in this case literal non-humans, as dangerous. Now, this is an amateur view on my part, but a lot of this is due to the changes that were basically wrought by the needs of colonialism and imperialism. As imperial colonial empires stretched across the globe, justifications had to be crafted for them. And it's just the plain truth that racism plays a large part in those justifications. If we go back to my Northern European video, where we show that the myths and legends argued strongly that mermaids and non-humans had souls and were just as worthy of humans of Christian salvation, which was very important to those societies at the time, the medieval myths and legends give mermaids and other non-humans a certain equality, an ideal that they mattered just as much as human beings in their own way, whereas when we get to Lovecraft's time, these are just monsters that are out to destroy us, and no cohabitation is ever possible. That said, I might be overstating it a little bit. The medieval time was not a time of, cuddly diplomacy and peaceful coexistence. There was plenty of stabbing people for being different, so just kind of bear that in mind as well. With that said, I'm going to stop here before I get too high on this soapbox. I just find it interesting to consider how different Lovecraft, a man from the beginning of the 20th century, viewed those things as opposed to people 500 years before him in the Middle Ages. All that said, I hope you found this video informative or at least entertaining. If you did, please leave a like, a comment, or even subscribe. All of these help me in my eternal struggle against the dread Lord Algorithm, terror be on his name. I'd like to give a special thanks to Big Steve, my biggest patron supporter. I could not pull this off without your support. Now, next week, we're going to go further away from mermaids. We're going to look at the Naga of Indian myths. And after that, I'm going to go into various water beings that aren't mermaids, before we return to mermaids by looking at various popular culture mermaids from movies, comics, and films. If you'd like to see a full list of what I have in mind, just let me know in the comments. I hope you'll join me for all of that, but until then, take care of yourselves, take care of each other, and of course, keep reading.